Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to see all of you here today. And I welcome you all on behalf of the International Centre Goa. This is a curtain raiser for our annual Goa Arts and Literary Festival. And we are very happy to have with us the author of The Accidental Prime Minister, Mr. Sanjay Baru. This launch has been organized by us in association with the Department of Political Science, Goa University and Penguin India. I extend a special welcome to the author of today's book, Dr. Sanjay Baru. He is the Director for Geoeconomics and Strategy, International Institute of Strategic Studies, London, and an Honorary Senior Fellow, Centre for Policy Research, New Delhi. He was the media advisor and principal speechwriter to the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, from 2004 to 2008. He has been Chief Editor for Business Standard and the Financial Express, Editorial Page Editor for the Times of India, and the Associate Editor for the Economic Times. He has also been a professor at the Indian Council for Research in International Economic Relations and a consultant with the Human Development Report Office, UNDP, and Asian Development Bank. He has lectured at Chatham House, London, National Defence College, Delhi, and Indian School of Business, Hyderabad. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him with a round of applause. This book is Dr. Baru's account of what it was like to manage public opinion for Singh while giving us a riveting look at Indian politics as it happened behind the scenes. I'm sure Dr. Baru will share his author's perspective with all of us here. This book will be released in the hands of our Honorable Chief Guest and Chair, Mr. Robin Gupta. Mr. Gupta is a former Financial Commissioner Revenue in the rank of Chief Secretary, Government of Punjab. Apart from writing for leading newspapers and journals, Mr. Gupta authored a bouquet of thoughts published by the Minerva Press, London in 2002, and also his memoirs, And What Remains in the End. He has also written poetry and prose on diverse subjects, ranging from nature, history, art, music, culture to Sufism. Kindly welcome him with a round of applause. May I request Mr. Robin Gupta to kindly say a few words before we release the book.
Esteemed Director, International Centre, Mrs. Sahai, Dr. Baru and friends. It is a great honor for me to be able to welcome Dr. Baru at Goa, which I hope will become my home someday. And this is a book I've read 2 or 3 times while I was in Delhi. In fact, I was so excited by the book that I rang up Mr. Hardakar here and I said, this is a book that needs to be shared in Goa. The author convincingly recounts his 4-year tenure as media advisor to Dr. Manmohan Singh, during which period he not only had an insider's view of governmental functioning at the highest level, but also the occasion to guide the Prime Minister in making top-level appointments and also in taking administrative decisions, some of which related to foreign policy. This book has given deep insights into the working of government, and it is a superb portrait of the Manmohan Singh era, last 10 years practically. What comes out is that in this system of dual control, there was a missing epicenter of governance. Now, there are 2 or 3 insights which I think are important. It is fortunate that this book became available just before the 16th general elections, for it gives an honest account of the manner in which the central government functioned, which to my mind was an insidious system of dual control set in place by the UPA-1 and UPA-2, with terrible failures and corruption of that dispensation. The accidental Prime Minister may in fact have had some impact on the elections, which is also significant from many points of view. The Indian public wanted to know the reasons for such terrible governance under the stewardship of Dr. Manmohan Singh, great economist, intellectual, in his personal life abstemious, and who had made probity, integrity in personal life a hallmark. How did all this happen under such a great man? So this book is all about that. Because it was a great dilemma for people to understand. Now, under Dr. Manmohan Singh, who I've had the pleasure of meeting more than once, we have the cash for vote scam. We have the 2G spectrum scam. We have the coal gate. We have the rail gate. We have the Commonwealth Games scam. We have the Vodafone tax scam. Then we have the Augusta Westland helicopter scam. Dr. Baru's book is an eye-opener that reveals that perhaps Dr. Manmohan Singh had to abdicate exercising powers and also to manage a coalition of almost 14 parties, each pulling in different directions. All these scams, they shook the faith of the public in the UPA. Dr. Baru's book is topical. Somebody told me the other day, "वो तो अब खत्म हो गई बात." I said, "खत्म नहीं हुई. It is topical. It will always remain topical because you have this peculiar political administrative arrangement where the Prime Minister and the person who rules, calls the shots, are two different people. Without meaning any ill will to anyone, because this is a political talk in one sense. It's a discussion of a great book, which is political history. Sonia Gandhi probably couldn't become the Prime Minister because of her Italian birth. And so we have Dr. Manmohan Singh, who is an ideal choice, honest, brilliant, acceptable to everyone. But then Dr. Manmohan Singh could neither exercise power, nor did he wish to. He just wanted to do his work in the background, and that is what he did. However, the results being what they were, the blame lies at the door of the Prime Minister. Because he was fully aware and agreeable to this agreement. And when he accepted the Prime Ministership. Digressing a little, let me draw your attention to the Times of India lead article on Monday, just on the 21st, which says how a corrupt judge continued in the Madras High Court. And he goes on to say, Justice Kanju, formerly judge of the Supreme Court, makes the startling revelation that a tainted judge got himself continued in office and promoted by the Prime Minister through the threat of support to the coalition being withdrawn. And the newspaper item says, Manmohan Singh was leaving New Delhi for New York. At the airport, he was told by the minister of the alliance partner that by the time he returned from New York, his government would have fallen if the corrupt chant was not continued. And Dr. Singh reportedly panicked until a Congress minister comes up to him and says, I'll manage everything. So thereafter, they approached the Chief Justice. Thereafter, the Chief Justice, with one stroke of the pen, supervenes 6 adverse entries. And the judges continued. He's promoted. The rest is history. In this case, their lordships of the Supreme Court were pleased to quote Shakespeare from Richard II. My dear, dear Lord, the purest treasure mortal times afford is spotless reputation. That away, men are but gilded loam or painted clay. This incident speaks volumes about the kind of power structure in Delhi that ruled India for 10 years. Now, to imagine that Dr. Manmohan Singh, a man of such modest needs and regulated requirement, a great economist, as I mentioned, an intellectual, should consent to continue as Prime Minister, affixing his seal and style to a series of wrong and criminal administrative decisions with far-reaching consequences. I have particularly liked Dr. Baru's beautiful and sensitive description of the Prime Minister as a young boy from Pakistani Punjab in a modest home in the village of Gah, without electricity, without water, rising to the high tables of Cambridge and Oxford. His record of service, Dr. Manmohan Singh's, is truly an uplifting story, his life and his record. However, we are concerned here with the role that Dr. Manmohan Singh played as revealed in these 10 years, some of which is reflected in the book, some of which is my own insights. There's no doubt that Dr. Singh was the architect of UP's second term, the victory in 2009. But his fatal flaw was he failed to assert himself. He told our author, distinguished author here, see, you must understand one thing. I have come to terms with it. There cannot be two centers of power. Was the Prime Minister's chair so important to such a modest man? Did not Dr. Manmohan Singh barter his soul to the devil in return for being able to continue as Prime Minister of India? These questions come to mind. I've known many of the actors in this, the principal secretary and Shiv Shankar Menon, the National Security Advisor, they're my batchmates, and Mr. Bora and others, they're Punjab cadre officers, Mr. Nair. Now the book comes out with another point, and Madam, I'm sorry I'm taking a little long, but I want to share a few things. I'll just conclude rapidly. The Congress party cannot look beyond the Nehru-Gandhi family. I mean, just to consider, a member of the family whistles and the entire party sits up. It's as bad as that. Therefore, the Congress could not keep up with the times. And yet it is remarkable that Dr. Singh, through all these twists and turns, had a trusting relationship with Sonia Gandhi. Dwelling on Dr. Singh's personality, Dr. Baru recalls that the Prime Minister rarely lost his temper, rarely chided ministers. In the highest tradition of civility, he quickly stepped in and did their work. Alas, Dr. Manmohan Singh demitted office on a low octave. He was not ruling India. The unquestioned ruler was Sonia Gandhi, as mentioned earlier. And yet, history will be kind to Dr. Singh. It will remember him as the finance minister who launched India's economic reforms in 1991 and eventually freed India from being choked by the restrictive license Raj policy, which had not allowed India to grow since 1947. Dr. Baru has written an important political history in a timely manner. I do not subscribe to the view that Dr. Baru has not been faithful to the Prime Minister, or that the timing of his book being published is to pay back Sonia Gandhi. This is a view that is expressed in some journals. As I pointed out earlier, the over deep debt of gratitude to Dr. Baru for explaining 10 years of confusion and also to guide the voter. And thus, the accidental Prime Minister steps forward from this finely written book as a defeated gentleman, lost in life's travail, taking a watery turn towards his destined doom. And today we have the honor of hearing from Dr. Baru the reality behind the accidental Prime Minister. Once again, sir, I congratulate you on writing a marvelous book that will further the borders of human knowledge. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. We also have with us Mr. Mehta here, who has published the Marathi version of this book. So before we release the book, would Mr. Mehta would you like to say a few words?
I'll just take a minute. Very good morning to all of you. We are here for the book launch of the most acclaimed, acknowledged and advocated book which was released during the Lok Sabha elections. And I have sold over 80,000 copies in just a month's time. My Prime Minister, The Making and Unmaking of Manmohan Singh by Mr. Sanjay Baru. I, Sunil Mehta from Mehta Publishing House, Pune, take this opportunity to welcome and thank you for being a part of this book launch ceremony. It's our honor to become the first regional language publisher for the most anticipated book in Marathi language. Today, we are honored to re-release this book at the hands of Mr. Robin Gupta. The Marathi translated version of this book was launched in Pune on 14th July. It was our pleasure to have Mr. Sanjay Babu as the chief guest. As said in Pune, Mr. Babu has many more things to pen down. We all look forward to see the second part of this book. I thank Mr. Babu for giving us this opportunity to re-release this Marathi version in Goa. I would also like to thank Penguin India, Mrs. Nandini Sai, International Center Goa, Department of Political Science, Goa University, for allowing us to be a part of this function, the Goan Marathi readers and the media. Last but not the least, I thank our production team who are all geared up to bring out this most anticipated book in just 2 months, which has been sold about 2,000 copies now. Thank you again.
Request Mr. Gupta now to kindly release the book.
We'll allow you to have that. Can you hold both of them? Yes, sir. So, it's a great pleasure.
Thank you. May I request now Dr. Babu to take the stage, please.
Mr. Gupta, Mr. Sahai, Mr. Mehta, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I must thank the International Center Goa for inviting me here for this event. I'm extremely grateful to my hosts. The call, of course, came from Mr. Gupta, and so I'm particularly grateful to him for taking the initiative. I'm also grateful to the University of Goa, the Political Science Department, and to Mehta Publishing House for being the first Indian language book to be out. Just one factual correction, 80,000 copies over 3 months, not 1 month. But we have sold 2,000 in 2 weeks. Well, that's great in Marathi. The fact is that neither I nor my publisher expected this to happen. In fact, when we were planning the launch of the book, my publisher hoped that she would be able to sell about 10,000 copies over a period of time. And so the first print run was actually only 5,000 copies. The book came out on the 11th of April. It was made available in bookshops in Delhi at about 11 a.m. on the 11th of April. And those of you who follow television would have seen the ruckus that TV created around the book by the night of 11th April. By 12th April evening, all the 5,000 copies were sold out across the country. In Delhi, Bombay, and Bangalore, there were 3 cities where they had first sent the first consignment. 11th April was a Friday, so by Saturday evening they were sold out. And on Sunday, Penguin started getting telephone calls from booksellers around the country, virtually shouting at them for not having made the book available because they had queues of people outside bookshops. And so Penguin had to stop printing other books and get their publisher to, the printer, to print another 10,000 copies, which were sold out in 3 days. Then they realized what was happening. They printed a third set of 20,000 copies that got sold out in 1 week. So within 2 weeks, 40,000 copies of the book were sold out, and I think that's when they realized that they had a bestseller on their hands. And then over the last 3 months, the other 40,000. But what is terribly sad for me and for the publisher is that now there's a pirated edition, a paperback in English, selling for 250 rupees on the streets of Mumbai and Delhi and all the cities. My daughter picked up a copy on the road in Delhi. Now these pirated copies, I don't get any royalty out of them. So frankly, the reason I say all this is that I didn't expect that this would become this kind of a bestseller. Incidentally, it set an all-India record now for non-fiction, hardbound non-fiction. Indian hardbound non-fiction has sold so many copies ever. So it's kind of been a newsmaker. And I think the reason for that is very simple. As Mr. Gupta very eloquently expressed, and I'm indeed grateful to you, sir, for your very fine observations. The reason for that is that there's been this tremendous thirst, particularly in middle-class India. Which in fact voted for Manmohan Singh, not for the Congress, not for Sonia Gandhi, not for Rahul Gandhi, but for Manmohan Singh in the election of 2009. The central thesis of my book is that in 2004, Manmohan Singh was an accidental Prime Minister. The title of the book is borrowed from what Dr. Singh himself used to say. He used to call himself an accidental Prime Minister. And that accident, how it happened, I've explained in the book in some detail. But in 2009, he was not the accidental Prime Minister. Because in 2009, the Congress party put its face on its manifesto and went to the people of India and said, we have given you 5 years of a Manmohan Singh government. Give us another 5. And the people of India gave the Congress and the UPA another 5 under the Prime Ministership of Manmohan Singh. And not only did they return the UPA to power, they actually gave 60 additional seats to the Congress party in Parliament. So the Congress went from about 150 to 210, 206. And a large part of that additional 60 seats came from urban India, where middle-class voters who in 2004 had voted for Mr. Vajpayee for a continuation of the Vajpayee government, because that middle class was happy with that Vajpayee government, switched its allegiance to the Congress because they were happy with those 5 years of Manmohan Singh. 9% growth, the highest ever in recorded history of this country, not just after independence, but in all recorded history. Those of you who are students of economics and know those numbers know that never in Indian history did you get 5 years of 9% growth. And that is what UPA delivered in its first term. Very important historic strategic agreements both with the United States and with China on the border issue, and so on and so forth. So therefore this urban middle class liked what Manmohan Singh was doing and voted for him. Not only did they switch their loyalty from Vajpayee of 2004, but they also expressed disappointment with the leadership of L.K. Advani. They were not happy with Advani. And that voter in 2014 has gone back to the BJP, attracted on the one hand by the leadership of Mr. Modi, but equally disappointed by the second term of the Manmohan Singh government. So my basic argument why I wrote this book was to remind people in 2014 that UPA 1 was not the disaster that UPA 2 was. The first time voters of 2014, 18-year-olds of 2014, in 2009 were barely teenagers. They just entered their teenage years. And I have, for example, in my mind, my own daughter, who became a first-time voter in 2014. And that generation was SMSing jokes about Manmohan Singh in 2012, 2013, in the months running up to election. The most famous joke, of course, was that Manmohan Singh goes to a dentist and the dentist says, at least here you can open your mouth. Right? That was the most famous SMS joke. But there are others which were not in such good taste. But hundreds of these jokes. Facebook and Twitter were full of ridicule. And television shows were there. Everybody was making fun of Dr. Singh. And this generation of first-time voters thought of Singh as a complete useless nincompoop. And I think I owed it, since I devoted almost 5 years of my life to working for him. I felt at least I owed it to my own daughter to explain to her that her father didn't waste his 5 years. Because she used to ask me, why the hell did you work for this guy? That's the generation, that's how they talk. They say, why the hell did you work for this guy? And I had to explain to her why he was not the Manmohan Singh that she was seeing in television, on Twitter, on Facebook, and SMS jokes and newspapers. Because he had been reduced to an object of ridicule. In 2012, Caravan magazine did a cover story on Dr. Singh. And when that correspondent interviewed me, I said to him that in politics it's all right for a political leader to be either loved or hated. Because people have followers, detractors. That's part of politics. But no political leader should run the risk of becoming an object of ridicule. That's the end of a political career. And that is exactly what had happened to Dr. Singh. So the book has been written to explain why, in my judgment, UPA 1 was actually a success. Mr. Gupta has referred to the criticism, which in a sense the book confirms, that Dr. Singh was not his own boss. I take a slightly different view in the book I believe that in 2004, he was in fact the nominated Prime Minister. That's a fact of life. You can't run away from facts. The election was a surprise result, which I've discussed in the book. But when that surprise result came, the Congress party had no option but to look for someone who could become the Prime Minister. In May 1999, on 25th May 1999, I wrote a column in the Times of India under the heading, The Perils of Sonia as PM. This column weeks after a famous incident where some of you would recall the Rashtrapati at that time, I think K.R. Narayan, if I'm not mistaken, called the Congress party to form a government because the government of I.K. Gujral had fallen. And Mrs. Gandhi went to Rashtrapati Bhavan, came out and stood in front of television cameras with a piece of paper and said, I have 272 MPs. You remember that famous statement. And Mulayam Singh then issued a statement a few hours later saying, sorry, she doesn't have 272 because that list includes Samajwadi Party and we are not supporting her. The assumption was that she was going to become Prime Minister. And there's in fact some circumstantial evidence to suggest that in fact that was probably her intention. And therefore I wrote a column in 25th May 1999 saying that Mrs. Gandhi made a tactical mistake or a strategic mistake of projecting herself as a Prime Minister. If she had only projected another Congress leader as a Prime Minister who would have been acceptable to Mulayam, she would have formed the government. Because she did have 272 with Samajwadi Party. So she could have picked up Pranab Mukherjee, she could have picked up Manmohan Singh, she could have picked up Arjun Singh, she could have picked up anyone and said Congress will form a government under the leadership of an Indian and not a woman of Italian origin. And the numbers would have come. So I wrote a column in which I actually ended that column, the last paragraph, and I quoted it in my book, where I said, the next time you get this opportunity, Mrs. Gandhi, think of Manmohan Singh. And the reason I wrote that column, the reason I suggested Manmohan Singh's name was because I knew that no political leader would nominate someone who could become an independent entity. When Bal Thackeray had the opportunity to form a Shiv Sena government. He picked up someone he completely trusted who would meet him every day and take orders from him, Manoj Joshi. When the CPM formed a government in Bengal in 1977, Pramod Dasgupta, who was the strongman of the CPM, the general secretary of the party in Bengal, insisted that every day Jyoti Basu should drive from his office to the party office and brief the party general secretary what he had done that day before going home. Many people don't know this. Every evening Jyoti Basu would drive from Writers Building to Lenin Sarani to the CPM headquarters, brief the party secretary that these are the decisions I've taken today, and then go home. Till Pramod Dasgupta died, that was the practice. It's only when Pramod Dasgupta died that Jyoti Basu stopped doing this and then became a leader in his own right. So the fact that he would play that kind of a role and not take over power in the manner in which Narasimha Rao did. In 1991, the Congress party had the opportunity to form a government. There were two candidates for prime ministership. There was Sharad Pawar, there was Narasimha Rao. And the scales tilted in Narasimha Rao's favor because Sonia Gandhi and her supporters, which included Arjun Singh and A.K. Antony and Digvijay Singh and various other people in the Congress party, favored Narasimha Rao over Sharad Pawar. That is why Sharad Pawar lost and Narasimha Rao became prime minister. But what did Narasimha Rao do then? He understood the nature of the Congress party, so he made sure that he became the party president. In April 1992, at the Tirupati session of the AICC, he made sure that the party made him the president. So he kept that job. And I explain in my book, for those of you who are students of political science, that this is an old issue in Indian politics. When Jawaharlal Nehru became prime minister, Acharya Kripalani, as the president of the Congress party, said to him that you need to brief me on the decisions the government is taking since I am the president of the party. Nehru told Kripalani, sorry, I cannot share with you what decisions the government takes because they are only internal to the government. Only the cabinet will be made aware. Once the decision is made public, you will also come to know. But till it becomes public, I cannot brief you because you are not a minister of the government. But if you want to know what the government is planning to do, become a minister without portfolio, come to the cabinet meetings, you would know what the government is planning to do. And Kripalani protested and he stepped down as Congress president. And after that, for a couple of years, I think, or a year, I think even Debar was made and then Nehru himself became president. And then this whole thing of the prime minister and the president being the same person continued. And whenever the president was different from the prime minister, the president was the rubber stamp. Indira Gandhi had Devkant Barua and several other people like that who, the president of the party became the rubber stamp, the prime minister was the center of power. For the first time, that got reversed, where the president retained the real power and the prime minister became a rubber stamp. So I begin with the view that, look, this was part of that arrangement. And yet, the fact is that in 2009, people of India voted this government back to power. So a large part of my book explains why between 2004 and 2009, Manmohan Singh's popularity went up. Which is why the subtitle of my book is The Making and the Unmaking. The making of Manmohan Singh. What is it that made him the Prime Minister is what occupies 13 chapters of my book. But I could not have ended my book with May 2009 because in 2014 the question that was being asked was not why Manmohan Singh got elected in 2009, but the question being asked was why is he what he is perceived to be today? What explains this decline? So that is what my last chapter is all about, the epilogue as I call it. And it's that last chapter that became controversial and became a subject of a lot of media attention and political attention from all the political parties and contributed to the sales of my book. So those of you who have read the book will understand that the balance actually tilts in favor of the Prime Minister or of Dr. Manmohan Singh. The balance of the book actually, as I've said on television on many occasions, this would remain the strongest defense of the Manmohan Singh Prime Ministership in UPA 1. but it also is the first analytical criticism of the second term. And the question, the answer I give to the question, what is responsible for the unmaking of Manmohan Singh? The unmaking began on the day the UPA got re-elected in 2009. One, I had said to him, and I mentioned in the book, that he should have contested for the Lok Sabha. Because in 2004, he was the accidental Prime Minister. It really didn't make a difference whether he was in Rajya Sabha or Lok Sabha. The government was given to him. But in 2009, he got elected as Prime Minister. The people of India gave him a second term. Therefore, he ought to have been in the Lok Sabha. I think the first fatal error of judgment was in not returning to power, in not returning to office from the Lok Sabha. And that was the beginning, in a sense, of the decline of his authority. The second factor is that in UPA 1, the entire focus of attention was to make a success of the government. Don't forget, the Congress party had never had the experience of running a coalition government except in the state of Kerala. Nowhere else in the country did the Congress ever run a coalition government. And the BJP's argument during Mr. Vajpayee's 6 years was, we have shown we can run a coalition. So the BJP was telling the regional parties that we are a better partner because, as Mr. Vajpayee has demonstrated, we have the capability of taking our allies along with us. The Congress is a one-person party dominated by a family. They don't have the experience of taking allies along with them. So they had to prove that this argument was not correct. And therefore, the government was forced to be much more consultative and inclusive in its functioning. And I have discussed in some detail how Dr. Manmohan Singh dealt with Sharad Pawar, with Karunanidhi, with other allies, and made sure that they're part of the decision-making system. So UPA 1 succeeded because of the fact that there was a political compulsion to make a success of it. But there was a second reason why UPA 1 succeeded, which is that Sonia Gandhi did not entertain any challenge to Manmohan Singh's authority. There were at least 3 people on 3 occasions who tried to challenge Manmohan Singh. Arjun Singh, Pranab Mukherjee, and Sushil Kumar Shinde. I mentioned some of that in the book, that on each occasion, when this issue came out, Pranab, of course, was not openly pitching to become the Prime Minister, but he certainly pitched to become the Deputy Prime Minister. And Mrs. Gandhi had to actually address a press conference in which she had to say there will be no Deputy Prime Minister and end Pranab Mukherjee's ambition of becoming a Deputy Prime Minister. In the case of Sushil Kumar Shinde, there was this whole thing of Congress making his Dalit as a Prime Minister, and it is Sharad Pawar who opposed Shinde being made Prime Minister. I mentioned in the book, Praful Patel came to me to convey to Manmohan Singh that we are with you, don't worry, we are not going to dump you in favor of Shinde. And Arjun Singh, of course, every day was plotting, and I mentioned how he was doing that even with Narasimha Rao. And Narasimha Rao once told me, quoting Lyndon Johnson, I don't know if some of you would have probably heard this once. Lyndon Johnson was told that this guy Edgar Hoover, who was the head of FBI, should be fired because Edgar Hoover was spying on the president and various ministers of the cabinet. So Lyndon Johnson said to whoever went and gave this advice, it's better for him to be inside the tent pissing out than to be outside the tent pissing in. And Narasimha Rao actually quoted that to me when I said to him, why don't you get rid of Arjun Singh? Because as you know, Arjun Singh was also revolting against Narasimha Rao. And Narasimha Rao actually quoted this. It's better for the guy to be inside pissing out than to be outside pissing in. So I told this to Manmohan Singh. I said, this is how Narasimha Rao dealt with Arjun Singh. I'm afraid you'll have to deal with Arjun Singh in the same way. But for all those reasons, UPA 1 remained stable. The problem in UPA 2 was that Mrs. Gandhi had to engineer the transition from Manmohan Singh to Rahul Gandhi. I mentioned the incident on the day the results came out. I was in Singapore, and Rajdeep Sardesai of CNN IBN said on television, we had an SMS exchange, and he said on television that Baru is saying that this victory is Manmohan Singh's. And he asked his panel in the studio, what do you guys think? And somebody said, yes, it's Manmohan Singh's victory. Somebody said, well, it's both Sonia and Manmohan Singh, etc. That was a discussion going on. And then one of the CNN IBN correspondents goes to 24 Akbar Road and interviews Prithviraj Chauhan, who was rewarded later with the Chief Minister of Maharashtra, and asked Prithviraj, who was the architect of the victory? And my friend Prithviraj said, Rahul Gandhi, on day one. So from day one, this problem arose. How do you engineer this transition? And in my judgment, failure of UPA 2 is because of this confusion at the top on how to build Rahul's personality without at the same time destroying Manmohan Singh's personality. And I think the lesson we learned is the Congress ended up destroying Manmohan Singh's personality but failed in building Rahul's personality. So it's this political failure in engineering this political transition from one generation to the other, from one prime minister to another, that ended in the complete paralysis of UPA2. That's the hypothesis I end the book with. I'll stop here. I'll be very happy to take questions. Thank you very much. I'll repeat the question for everybody. I can hear you, so go ahead.
Two things. One is what the incident which Mr. Gupta referred to about the article in the Times of India. You specifically referred to Dr. Manmohan Singh being very deferential to the DMK Supremo. Was he not aware of this kind of thing happening when the justice was to be confirmed, or his additional judgeship to be extended? That's one. But that happened in UP1 when you were part of the PM. Second was in UPA2, you distinctly remarked, I remember your comment, that when Rahul Gandhi commented that in a press club that this ordinance be scrapped and Dr. Manmohan Singh was abroad, that he should have resigned. Why didn't he do so? What was your opinion of why he didn't do so?
Well, on the first question, I really don't have an answer because, a lot of these things would happen without my knowledge. I mean, after all, if you have seen from whatever has been reported in the press, this was a conversation between two people, and so there was no third person present, so we have to believe one or the other.
Well, there was a PMO note which came out.
No, I know. I'll come to that. But I'm saying that the original statement that a DMK person spoke to the Prime Minister, which Karju has referred to, is a conversation with two people. Now, Mr. Karju may have some reasons for claiming that he knows what happened, but I don't know, so I can't answer. On the letter from PMO, etc., again, since I was not privy to any correspondence between the Prime Minister's office and various ministries, it's not as if those letters would go through me. Therefore, I cannot say anything more than what's already in the press. So I'm afraid on that I can't shed any additional light. But on the general issue of such judges getting appointed, etc., and political interference, and the fact that the procedure for appointment of judges, on which there's been a lot of discussion going on in the last few days on television and the print, etc. I do think that a lot of weight to the argument that mistakes have been made, the system is not perfect. Both the judiciary and the executive are responsible for the current state of affairs. And I think this idea of a National Judicial Commission or whatever may be one way out. We don't know how it will finally pan out. On the second question, on why did Dr. Singh not resign when Rahul Gandhi, well, by that time the game was over. Of course, I did go on television and say that he should quit. And I know that members of his own family were telling him that he should quit. So I guess, this was what? This was September. Yeah. The game was over. I think in many ways you would have thought, what difference does it make? You'll have a new prime minister for 5 months before elections. And then also it's a loyalty to the party. The party asked him, from whatever we know from the press, because I was not in government, Mrs. Gandhi personally went and apologized to him on behalf of her son, her 40-year-old son. Sorry, mera beta galat kaam kiya. So all of us apologized on behalf of our kids to people. So he took the apology.
Yeah, Datesh Parulekar, Faculty of International Relations at Goa University. Thank you, Dr. Balu, for writing this book, because you've really done a great service to public domain in terms of cataloging some of the inside track on some of these issues. I have an observation and then a question. First, the observation regarding what we often do with regard to Dr. Manmohan Singh. I think we've got into this notion of peddling things about his integrity and how good a man he is and blah, blah, blah. And I think by doing that, we actually obfuscate the issue even more. History is replete with examples of all these good men who have just sat around as things have come down unraveling. I think the point is a grave indictment to people like these, that they have been nude spectators and allowed rapacious plunder of resources, and I don't think it really matters whether the man is personally honest or not, if what's happened on his watch. The question that I have is regarding, since I'm from international relations, is regarding the whole debate on the nuclear deal. What is widely understood is that on the nuclear deal, the Prime Minister showed some spine. In internal conversations with Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, he is believed to have told her that if the deal doesn't go through, then I think it doesn't make much sense for me to continue. How true or untrue is this? And if this be true, then it actually just confirms this whole aphorism that Mr. Manmohan Singh actually was an overvalued economist and an undervalued politician. He knew when to cherry pick instances, and that is why he survived in the treacherous domain of politics. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I should have mentioned earlier that I thank you for your remark about the book being an addition to policy. The first phone call I actually got within a couple of days of the book being available was from a professor at IIM Bangalore who teaches a course in public policy. IIM Bangalore offers a public policy program. And he said, I have been desperately looking for a book for my course on the functioning of the government of India. And the last person who wrote a book, we mentioned someone, was 40 years ago, 30 years ago. And he says, I keep using memoirs of various people like P.C. Alexander and J.N. Dixit, but a lot of those memoirs don't have. And what this book does offer is a much more detailed discussion of the structure of decision making. So I do in fact realize that it's an important addition to public policy in the country, and that is often not understood or acknowledged in the kind of political discussions because of the nature of the controversy generated around the book. But on your question, I'm glad you asked this question on the nuclear deal. One, because I didn't actually refer to it in my remarks, while actually 2 full chapters are devoted to the nuclear deal in the book. And I think this is now the first detailed, authentic account of what happened on the nuclear deal. I know there are a couple of others writing books, a full book on the nuclear deal, and when those come out, they'll be even more detailed. But so far, nobody has actually put all of this together. And I think, once again, in the domestic political debate, because of the focus being on this whole issue of the relationship between the Prime Minister and the party president, not enough attention was paid to these 2 chapters, which actually are substantial chapters on foreign policy and decision making in that region. Well, you see, it's a bit more complicated than that. First of all, I don't think we need to be apologetic in saying here is a man who actually valued personal integrity. Because you do get a lot of people who don't even value personal integrity. So to the extent that you have someone who, after having been Prime Minister for 10 years, you can't find a single act of personal corruption involving this gentleman, or in fact, I would say most of his colleagues. I won't say all of his colleagues, but most of you. By colleagues, I mean not ministers, but his own office staff in the Prime Minister's office. There are one or two bad eggs, but by and large, it is probably the most incorruptible Prime Minister's office we've had since it was. So that's credit you must give him. Having said that, of course, you can say, why did he not take action against his ministers? Why did he not put his foot down on A, B, C, D? I mean, that debate will go on. I have some explanations in my book. Some may accept my explanation, others may not accept my explanation. That's fine. I mean, I'm sure at some point somebody would write another book with a more convincing argument, either in his defense or a more damning indictment. That's for others to do that. But on this whole issue of his stand on the nuclear deal, there is a wrong perception, again generated by unfair political criticism, that this had become an obsession for him, that he was looking at it as his personal legacy. What will history remember me by? And this is one thing I must do. I don't think that was the way in which he looked at the whole issue. The way he looked at the whole issue was, first of all, this was a historic agreement. The initiative for this was taken by Mr. Vajpayee as Prime Minister when he launched the first steps in strategic partnership with the US, and the next steps in NSSP, the next steps in strategic partnership with the US. So the discussions had come a long way. And what Dr. Singh decided to do was to continue those discussions. What had changed was not really thinking in India. What had changed was thinking in Washington. When Mr. Vajpayee was pursuing this with the Bush government was not prepared to do the deal with India. By the time Manmohan Singh became Prime Minister, Condi Rice became Secretary of State. The resistance in Washington was coming from the non-proliferation lobby, from people like Colin Powell, who was a great friend of the Pakistanis. And so the Pakistan lobby, the China lobby, and the non-pro lobby, all these three lobbies in Washington were opposed to the nuclear deal. But Condi Rice becoming Secretary of State changed that. Because those of you who are students of international relations know that she wrote that seminal essay in 2000 in Foreign Policy, in which she argued that the United States should pick India as a long-term strategic ally, right, partner. And therefore, that changed the game. And then President Bush got completely convinced that this was something he had to do. Plus, Bush realized that the war in Iraq was a mistake. He was forced into that war by the friends of his father, all this Rumsfeld and Cheney and all these guys. And I think he was looking also for a legacy that he could end his presidency, his second term, on having done something good for America. And he saw a relationship with India as a positive thing. So it is the commitment of President Bush that finally delivered the deal. And the point had come when the 123 agreement was signed. The Hindu newspaper had a headline editorial which said, "A sound and honorable agreement." I have discussed that in great detail in my book. The day the Hindu had an editorial, I called up N. Ram, who, as you know, was member of the CPM, a friend of Prakash Karat, and I said, "Ram, thanks a lot for this editorial. The Prime Minister is delighted to read it. We are grateful to you for your support." Both the Prime Minister and all of us in the office assumed that this was a signal from the left, because we knew Ram was a friend of Prakash Karat. So I said to Ram, "Why don't you, Ram said, "Please convey my personal regards to the PM and congratulate him." So I said to Ram, "Why don't you come personally and say that yourself?" So Ram flew down to Delhi. I organized a breakfast for him with Manmohan Singh. Three of us sat for 1 hour, for 1 full hour, where Manmohan Singh had no breakfast because his stomach was filled with praise. Ram praising him about how he had created history, And for him, this was music. And injected a lot of spending into the system because revenues were rising. The mistake was made in 2009, or 2008, 2009, when the crisis hit us. We should have immediately become conservative. Right? That's sorry, not the Chinese, the Brazilians did that, the Singaporeans did that. A lot of them cut back on spending because they anticipated a fall in growth. In our case, one, we did not anticipate. It was election year. No government reduces spending in an election year. If anything, they increase spending in an election year. So despite the brakes on spending, be right. And that fundamental change has happened in a very easy democratic way, unlike in the Arab world or unlike in many other countries where Twitter and social media have disrupted societies, destabilized societies without a stable change, right? But that same social media and a tremendous political awakening of a large mass of people have created a very new electorate. And I think the first person who understood this was Mr. Modi himself, not even his party. And I think the reason why the BJP lagged behind its own leader, dragging its own feet to name him as their leader, was because they were also unaware of the sea change that is happening in this country. I come from Andhra Pradesh. I know my state inside out. And I can tell you that my state people have fundamentally changed. In fact, I cannot see any future for the Congress party in Andhra Pradesh. I think the party is over. There are many states in the country where the party is over. What Manmohan Singh did for UP, for the Congress, was to give it 10 years of power beyond its sell-by, use-by date. The Congress began decline. If you see the numbers, Yogendra Yadav and some of these guys do have these numbers. Unfortunately, he has also become a politician. So, being a good researcher and analyzing data, now he is manufacturing data. But if they look at these numbers, what is the story that you hear, or that you see? You see a story of a secular decline of the Congress vote. Right? It's being replaced by whatever alternative is available. So in some states it's a regional party, in some states it's the BJP, etc., etc. The same thing has happened to the communists. There's been a secular decline in the communist vote across the country. And therefore we are at the cusp of a political transition in India. How this will evolve is premature at this stage to see. I mean, people say, 5 years from now there'll be inflation, there'll be something else, people will look for an option. But when they look for an option, what would be the options available? It's not very clear. Because the Congress is in serious crisis. It just does not have a leader for the next election. So how the different, and many regional parties are in crisis. DMK has survived on Karunanidhi, who is now 80 plus, close to 90. Samajwadi party is in crisis. So even regional parties, by 2019, you don't know which of them will survive. Right? So I think from a political point of view, we are at a very interesting stage. I keep saying this, that we are probably seeing the birth of India's second republic. The first republic was inaugurated in 1950 and survived for 60 years. And you can call that the Nehruvian republic. So you have Nehru, Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi, Sonia Gandhi, etc. People coming and going, but even Atal Bihari Vajpayee liked to be seen as a Nehruvian. His right-hand man was inherited from the Nehru clan, Rajesh Mishra. When he wrote the Kumarako Musings, if you remember, I wrote an editorial. The headline of that editorial was Atal Bihari Nehru. And many in the Congress party took this, showed it to Sonia Gandhi and said, this fellow is a pro-Vajpayee guy. And I said to them, why do you think a headline like Atal Bihari Nehru means that I'm being pro-Vajpayee? Why can't you think of my saying that he's being pro-Nehru? Think about it. Vajpayee, if you remember, said that in his youth, when Nehru praised him, his ambition was to be like Nehru. He said that in one of his speeches or essays. Because Nehru was the hero of his generation, right? So, in my view, that was the first republic. And the first republic has come to its end. We are in the throes of a second republic. How that second republic will be shaped, who will define its characteristics, I don't know. I mean, I'm not suggesting the constitution will undergo a fundamental change, but I think the political processes of this country are undergoing change. And I think therefore, since you are a political scientist, and I'm saying all this because I guess some of your students are here, this is a great subject for research, to analyze in great detail the nature of the political transition as we've seen in the last decade. If you can do that, that will, you'll be contributing to understanding of this country.
Just one question. Excuse me. I understand Narendra Modi doesn't have a press advisor. And not having a press advisor may be good because you don't have a portfolio of journalists, favorite journalists around you. And I do think what he's doing is wise for media management.
I've refused to answer that question for the last 10 days. I've been invited by various TV channels. In fact, there's some seminar going on in Delhi today, organized by the Forum of Media Professionals. They asked me to speak there. I said, I don't want to speak. Every Prime Minister has a right to decide how he runs his office, whom he will appoint, what his strategy would be. It's Mr. Modi's decision. I don't see why the hell we should all worry about what he's doing. And I certainly don't want to comment on it.
You're right in saying that there has been a shift, if you like, in the perception of the average Indian, which is perfectly fair. But in the past 2 months, do you not detect a change in the social as well as the political ambiance of the country? And do you think this is healthy for the long run, in the long run? Do you feel that there's a tilt in favor of a fundamentalist type of India that might be emerging?
I'm not competent to answer. I don't pay. Most of my time is taken thinking about geoeconomics and trade and foreign policy and stuff like that. I'm not a sociologist. I read the same newspapers, I guess, as you read. I see same television. Though actually I don't see television. I see only food shows on television. I don't see news on television. But this country is a complex country. It's a very, very complex country. And it's an extremely diverse country. And, so I wouldn't worry too much. It's like a huge ship. One part of the ship, there's something happening, it doesn't affect the other part of the ship. Right? You have a Queen Elizabeth in the ocean. There may be trouble brewing in some cabins of the ship. Big deal. This is too big a country for trouble here, there, etc. to disrupt. I have tremendous faith in this country. I actually do believe that if in the next 10 years we do only 2 things, educate our people, make every Indian literate, just invest in education and build decent cities, because urbanization is increasing by the day. We will overtake China. We'll overtake China by 2050, not before that. Our challenge between now and then is to live with a China that is more powerful. But by 2050, I don't see any reason why India cannot become the world's #1 country. Provided we invest in education and infrastructure, basic things, sanitation, good roads, housing, basic infrastructure and education. I think these are the 2 things. If the government focuses on just these 2 and leaves everything else to the private sector, well, I guess health and education, not just education. Health, education and infrastructure. These are the three things government should do. And leave everything else to enterprise, private enterprise.
Excuse me. Regarding what you just said and what Mr. Duke said about the corruption in the Prime Minister's office, I mean, not the scams that took place when Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister. What's different about that from any other Prime Minister? What's different about that from any Chief Minister? You just said education and building of the roads and decent cities. But all the politicians in India are always on the take. It's one constant scam after the other, without any question. Every day in the Herald, about 3 scams, major scams, are reported just in go. And it just goes on and on and on, and until the people of India band together and say, we are not going to take it anymore, and march on Delhi, and march on the cities where the prime ministers are in Ali Gandhi style, peacefully, nothing's going to change. It's just to get to Donapala, when that road is torn up in Miramar, which it was torn up how long ago? 6 months ago, and then another big scam, they're rebuilding it because they're building it now with cement. I mean, it's just, it never ends. It just never ends. I mean, there's many brilliant people in this country, and the caste system, and it's coming, seems to be coming back, except with the young crowd, say 18 to 28. They don't seem to be so conscious of the caste system and whether someone's Hindu or Christian or Parsi or Muslim or whatever. But until the corruption stops, what chance does India have?
Right,
and then it's accepted. It's accepted. No one
end
does
on that
anything
last
about
question.
it.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, my book is not about that, so my views are as good as your views on this subject. But let me, since you raised the point, make a couple of observations, and I'll stop at that. First of all, I share your concern. But, marching on Delhi is not going to end corruption. Marching on anyone is not going to end corruption. I think this whole business of people sitting out on the streets, which this Aam Aadmi Party tried to do, is a silly way of dealing with corruption. The best way of dealing with corruption is by changing systems. I just give you 2 examples. I belong to a generation where you couldn't get a railway reservation without paying money to someone. That era is over. My daughter belongs to a generation where she goes online and gets her booking done. Right? So there's no more corruption in railway bookings because you can go online and book your ticket. I belong to a generation where if your telephone didn't work, you have to pay a bribe to a telephone repair guy to come home and repair your phone. My daughter belongs to a generation where she can go and change her phone every day. The new model that come, put in a SIM card, and she's not bribing anyone to get a telephone connection. So technology has reduced or eliminated corruption in a large set of areas where corruption was rampant. There are procedural ways in which governments can deal with this, and that is what all of us as civil society members and thinking people should focus on. How do you eliminate corruption in different aspects of life in this various institutions? And that's what you have to do rather than march on anybody or sit and starve and have these fancy hunger strikes where you're eating in the night and fasting in the morning. Having said that, let me say something very cynical, because I'm an economist and we look at numbers. When I look at the numbers, there is no evidence to suggest that there's a positive relationship, a negative relationship between corruption and development. No, none at all. Countries that have done very well on all development indicators have been extremely corrupt countries, China being the best example. In fact, corruption sometimes contributes to development. What it does, don't get me wrong, I'm not justifying it. What corruption does is it increases inequality. You know, purely as an economist, when I look at corruption, what is corruption? I'm transferring money from one person and putting it into the hands of another. That is what is corruption, for a service performed, right? And that transfer of money creates inequality, or rather accentuates inequality. Some become rich and somebody gets impoverished. There is a problem of inequality, but inequality, as we know, is a part of any development process. So there is a disconnect between the problem of corruption and the problem of development. And we need to deal with the problem of corruption because it is not ethical and it is inequalizing and it is unfair, but not because it's coming in the way of development. You can have very high rates of growth and 100% literate society like China with fairly good infrastructure, but very high levels of corruption. But as I said, that's a very cynical answer. It's not a kind of answer that you like, particularly on a Saturday afternoon before lunch. But as I said, I'm an economist, I look at numbers, and that's what the numbers tell us. But those are purely my thoughts, they're as good as yours. I don't claim that my thoughts are superior to your thoughts. Since there's nothing to do with the book, I'm happy to say what I like. But I'm grateful to all of you, for those of you who have read my book, and those of you who intend to read it. Thank you.
Before we end, I think Mr. Robin Gupta would like to present his book to Dr. Sanjay Baru.
I'd like to present it on my behalf. Thanks to you that we have this wonderful function.
Thank you. And thank you very much for, I'm very, very grateful, Dr. Baru, that you took time out and came here. We are very grateful. Thank you, Dr. Gupta, Mr. Mehta. And thank you all of you. And Dr. Baru is available for signing the books which are available outside. Thank you very much.